Can you hear? Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, sounds good. Well, my name is Jenifer Medina. I'm a fourth year anthropology major, and I'm honored to be here sharing my research with you all. And my project is titled It's Not Permaculture, It's Ancestral Knowledge Exploring Black, Queer, and POC Participant Narratives of the US Permaculture Movement. So in February of this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the first report in its 30 years of publications that identified colonialism as the cause of climate change. And this is a remarkable shift in the narrative, acknowledging the various ongoing ways that Indigenous peoples are marginalized and dispossessed by nation states, and the culture of amnesia and complicity that continue to exacerbate the climate crisis. So in this presentation, I hope to communicate how climate change and settler colonialism are interrelated, and to forefront Indigenous peoples' intellectual, economic, cultural, and social paradigms and tools that continue to guide us forward in healing, even against the backdrop of silencing and erasure. Um, so I situate my research in this context as an analysis and digital ethnography of the underrepresented and minoritized grassroots participants of a social movement called permaculture, as being one of the many movements at the intersection.
Are we losing you? What's happening? Jenifer, we don't hear you.
About an academia revolving around the
Oh, you're back.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I cut out for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm showing some background of what is permaculture. And I was saying permaculture originally came about in academia revolving around the question of how do we move away from unsustainable industrialized agriculture toward permanent agriculture? And this question evolved to encompass all aspects of human life, envisioning a permanent culture, one that is built to last for generations to come. So in the late 1970s, two Australian researchers studied traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and synthesized varying techniques, practices, and philosophies into this seminal text called Permaculture: A Designer's Manual. And like many grassroots movements, permaculture is limited in its reach. Previous research from 2015 found that 96% of US-based participants are white, well-educated, and affluent. So due to time, I won't delve into the constraints that shape these sociodemographics, but one example is standardized permaculture education, which is expensive and time intensive. And the homogeneity of this movement also shapes the culture to be one that is less receptive to issues of intersectionality. So although permaculture as a distinct movement and concept is relatively new, Indigenous peoples' TEK, which is a belief system, a practice, and epistemology, has been around for an unquantifiable span of time. Indigenous peoples acquire their knowledge through experience by being in relationship with their land and pass it down across generations. And these traditions are still being practiced and cultivated by Indigenous peoples all over the world today. So what permaculture's founders have done is extract TEK from Indigenous communities, change the nomenclature, as well as frame it within the ways of knowing in the Western paradigm. So for these reasons, permaculture, while being a useful and impactful framework, is highly criticized from both outside and within the movement for whitewashing TEK by removing it from its cultural and historical context. So Jesse Watson asks in the article, Decolonizing Permaculture, how can we expect to design a regenerative legacy for our descendants if we haven't yet made peace with the ancestors? And this is an example of a permaculturist who sees how the movement is limited by not prominently addressing historical social inequities. So these criticisms culminated in the formation of what I term subcultures, referred to in the movement as permaculture for the people and liberation or social permaculture, that frame their use of permaculture as a tool in working towards liberation for all people. And this involves connecting with ancestral lineages through TEK for the interconnected goals of healing, community and resilience building, and land-based resistance. And my research, while broadly analyzing the movement, is situated in the subculture of the reappropriation of the design framework known as permaculture. So against this backdrop of context into the problematics of permaculture, my research focuses on who is that 4%. There are no previous anthropological explorations into the proliferation of permaculture in the US, much less one that focuses on its minority participants. So my project identifies those minorities in US-based permaculture as having BIPOC, LGBTQ, disabled, recent immigration, and low-income identities and backgrounds. And my research questions are deeply interrelated, and in this presentation, I'll focus on communicating how the multivocality of minoritized participants in permaculture conceptualize the framework as ancestral knowledge and as a practice for intersectional social justice and decolonizing land-based work. I navigated my research through a digital ethnography of the online permaculture movement, and I also held 7 remote semi-structured interviews with volunteer participants. And my sample ranged from 23 to 39 years old. They were also similar in that they are well educated with bachelor's to master's degrees from various disciplines, and most have access to intergenerational wealth, but a couple are from working class backgrounds, and none have children or other dependents. On the other hand, my participants are from varying racial, ethnic, immigrant backgrounds and sexual and gender identities. Our conversations focused on the ways in which they subjectively experience permaculture, touching on resonance, challenges, motivations, envisionments for the future, and recommendations for ameliorating those issues that they identify. For my leading frameworks, I approach my research from an intersectional space as both a methodology for problematizing the ways in which permaculture excludes groups of people, and also as a framework for thinking through the differences and similarities in the experiences of my participants. And I also draw from indigenous feminisms to situate permaculture as entangled in the ongoing process of settler colonialism and the participants of permaculture as agents who each have a relationship to settler colonialism as settlers on native land. So going into my interviews, I expected that my participants would view and experience permaculture in a manner that is informed by their intersectional identities. So at the beginning of each interview, I would ask my participants how they view permaculture, and 5 out of 7 participants expressed similar perspectives that expand mainstream understandings of permaculture and what usage of that term evokes. So for the top excerpt, Totok is a student, landscaper, designer, and consultant based in Southern California. And she answered bluntly, permaculture to begin with is not the right word. With a lot of things, it all goes down to colonization. I call it ancestral knowledge. For my white clients, I call it permaculture. So Totot grew up learning what is called permaculture as ancestral knowledge from her Mexican and indigenous elders, and sees it as the appropriation of a system of knowledge rooted in indigeneity into a paradigm that is shaped to appeal to whiteness. So she reports that as a business owner, economic security is a challenge for her, and negotiates her usage of language with the trendiness of permaculture to provide services that align with her values. So in other words, the use of the word permaculture influences her white, affluent clientele to be more open to sustainable landscaping and the design services, but at the same time, she views the movement as a perpetrator in our condition of settler colonialism because it erases cultures whose knowledge permaculture is based on. And so expanding on this, Raven is a community organizer and permaculture course facilitator based in the Northwest. And they say, I describe permaculture as stolen indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge. I don't feel like in my experience, permaculture and permaculturalists adequately reciprocate what has been gifted, the knowledge that we've encountered, that we've received, that we've taken from people. So out of the sample, Raven has the most experience in the movement, and their perspective is informed by both witnessing the lack of reciprocity in terms of resources, land, and like the power to shape narratives offered in return to minoritized and indigenous communities, but also from being in community themselves with indigenous peoples, noticing a disconnect between TEK and permaculture. And so their critical perspective comes down to the historical wrongdoings on part of researchers and leaders in the movement in portraying permaculture as a novel idea and taking apolitical stances indifferent to intersectional issues and indigenous revitalization in politics. In addition, they show that the term permaculture is fluid, having different meanings, carrying with it tensions and histories of places, peoples, and cultures. And so I hope these excerpts provided insight into how some participants redefine permaculture by situating it against the backdrop of colonization informed by their cultural identities, experiences in and critiques of the movement, awareness of the interconnectedness of social issues, and sympathy for all peoples affected by colonization. The complexity of permaculture is emphasized by the interrelated themes of finding connection, finding connection, healing intergenerational trauma, and fostering futurity through permaculture, also expanding upon the theme of redefining permaculture. So even though Raven views it through a strong critical lens, they say that in terms of its origins of TEK, I think that is why I'm drawn to permaculture, because as many people who are displaced and disoriented, permaculture can be a bridge science back into a more indigenous way of living with the land, not as a replacement. But if we're able to actually be guided by BIPOC, I think I'm always going to advocate for that over anything that deems itself permaculture. So Raven shares in this quote how their participation was what exposed them to TEK, is what appealed to them primarily, and initiated their personal journey towards what they call re-indigenization, or becoming indigenous to a place by being in right relations. And that provides a sense of belonging and deep connection to a place and the community there, which is a form of healing. They also make it clear, however, that they do not have commitments to the movement because it is rooted in colonialism, and they envision a decolonized movement led by BIPOC. And for the next quote, Trillium is a student, urban farmer, educator, and herbalist based in Northern California. And we were talking about the emotional experience of the social dynamics in BIPOC versus like white majority spaces. So they say, learning from these Black and queer elders, I feel like the learning process is also a remembering. It feels like way back, I knew how deep to put this seed. It's also been a real ancestral awakening to be on the land with Black and Brown and Indigenous folks, because so much of our shared history is around either total dispossession from the land or forced labor on the land. And so when we show up of our own volition and decide how we're going to co-create land, it feels very transcendent and powerful. Trillium's experience of being introduced to their ancestral knowledge through people who they share identities with is like unlikely in the movement for minorities, and yet the experience, you can feel like through their words how impactful it is, through an awareness that colonization supplants culture and identity. Their reintroduction to land stewarding traditions has allowed them to connect to their ancestors, to land, to history, to people, where they are agents of resistance, not in spite of the land-based trauma, but because there is empowerment and healing involved in the act of forming alliances and working towards community sufficiency to resist systems that have not always operated to benefit their communities.
Jenifer, can you conclude in 2 minutes?
Yes. Expanding on the theme of futurity, the participants whose words I've shared with you today and others who I didn't have a chance to are a part of the land-based movement for collective liberation underlying the permaculture movement. And so let me read this real quick. Representation has to go even deeper than being representative. It has to be actual leadership, actual empowerment. And by empowerment, I mean having the power to make decisions about where resources go, what happens. And if you're a white person saying that you're a permaculture practitioner, you have to be on board with land back and reparations. So here Trillium comments on the context of white supremacy in which permaculture is embedded, that they've observed token representation, arguing that it is impossible to maintain the systems that got us here in the first place, but that the movement must take action in redressing them by transferring resources and power back into those communities who have claim and stakes to that knowledge underpinning the movement.
Okay, 1 minute, please.
So to reflect on my findings, my participants engaged 3 primary themes. They redefined permaculture by acknowledging the context of settler colonialism and broadening the narrative to include indigenous and diasporic claims. At the same time, their engagement with permaculture facilitates the holistic rethinking of their relationships to the land and all that accompanies, which is also facilitating a reimagining of their identities and politics, and part of the process in healing intergenerational wounds. Third and lastly, my participants engaged notions of indigeneity, of re-indigenization, a process through which they are both centering indigenous ways of knowing and forefronting indigenous peoples in the actual work. And so these are my references. Thank you for listening. And I'd like to acknowledge my faculty mentor, Dr. Katia Gunther, real quick, and the Mellon Undergraduate Fellowship, and my volunteer participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenifer. Sorry